It was just another quiet evening on the colony. The sun was setting, casting a warm, orange glow through the windows of the small house. Inside, the kitchen smelled of spices and fresh vegetables, a comforting reminder of home. The protagonist, an experienced human soldier who had retired to this peaceful life, stood in front of the stove stirring a pot of stew. Their hands moved rhythmically as they had done thousands of times before. But tonight felt different. Their stepson, Zarek, a young alien boy from a distant planet, was sitting at the kitchen table. He had always been curious about human culture, especially the way humans prepared food. Zarek was fascinated by everything, and his questions never seemed to stop. Sometimes they were innocent, like asking about the flavors in the stew or how humans made bread rise. Other times they were more thoughtful, like asking about the history of Earth or why humans loved stories of great warriors. Zarek's species was a peaceful one, known for their intelligence and their commitment to understanding other cultures. Yet there was something about Zarek that felt different. His eyes, though young, were sharp and filled with a wisdom that seemed out of place for a child of his age. He had been living with the protagonist for several years now, ever since his family had made an alliance with the humans. But despite his peaceful nature, there was an intensity in Zarek that the protagonist couldn't quite explain. Tonight, as the stew simmered, Zarek pushed his chair back and leaned forward. His large, silver eyes locked onto the protagonist, and for a moment everything in the kitchen felt still. Zarek's voice broke the silence. "Would you help me become a warrior?" Zarek asked, his tone serious but filled with an underlying curiosity. The words hung in the air, and for a second, the protagonist didn't know how to respond. They froze, their spoon still in the pot, as the question replayed in their mind. A warrior? Zarek was only a child. The protagonist had never seen him as anything more than that. A child who was still learning about the world, still trying to understand the complexities of life. But there was something in the way Zarek had asked. It wasn't a casual question, thrown out in passing. It was a request, a deep one, as if Zarek had been thinking about it for a long time. The protagonist set the spoon down and turned to face him, their heart heavy with an unspoken sense of responsibility. "You want to be a warrior?" the protagonist asked, their voice soft. Zarek nodded, his expression unreadable. "I want to learn the ways of the human warriors. I want to protect my people, just like you protect us." The protagonist's mind raced. They had been a warrior once, fighting in battles that had scarred both their body and their soul. They had seen the horrors of war up close. The destruction, the loss, the feeling of helplessness when faced with an enemy too powerful to defeat. They had vowed to leave that life behind, to settle down and live in peace. But here in front of them was Zarek, asking them to return to that world they had tried so hard to escape. The protagonist leaned back against the counter, unsure of what to say next. "Zarek, being a warrior is not easy," they said, choosing their words carefully. "It's not just about fighting. It's about making hard choices, dealing with loss, and sometimes not being able to save everyone." Zarek's eyes widened, and he stood up, his small frame filled with determination. "But that's what I want. I want to help. I want to learn how to protect my people just like you protect us." The protagonist could see the fire in Zarek's eyes. It was the same fire they had seen in their own eyes when they were young, eager to prove themselves, to be part of something bigger than just themselves. But now, years later, that fire had dimmed, replaced by the exhaustion of a life lived in battle. It wasn't that the protagonist didn't want to help Zarek. It was just that the thought of pulling someone so young into that world filled them with dread. "I don't think you understand what you're asking," the protagonist said, trying to push back the uncomfortable feeling growing in their chest. "War isn't a game. It's not something you can just turn on and off. It changes you. It takes things from you that you can't get back." Zarek's face remained serious. "I understand," he said quietly. "But I want to be strong. I want to be someone who can protect the people I love." The protagonist sighed, rubbing a hand over their face. They had always admired Zarek's determination, but this was different. This was asking for something they weren't sure they could give. Could they really train Zarek to be a warrior? Could they bring him into that world of violence and fear, knowing the risks, knowing the cost? For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the soft bubbling of the stew on the stove. Finally, the protagonist spoke, their voice heavy with the weight of the decision they knew they would have to make. "I can't promise you that it will be easy, Zarek," they said slowly. "But if you're sure about this, if you really want to become a warrior, I'll help you. I'll teach you everything I know, but you have to be prepared for what that means." Zarek's face lit up, a smile breaking through the seriousness of his expression. "I am ready," he said, his voice filled with determination. "I'll do whatever it takes." The protagonist nodded, feeling a mixture of pride and fear. This wasn't the life they had planned for Zarek, but it was the life he had chosen. And in that moment, the protagonist realized that they couldn't say no, not to Zarek, not to the child they had come to care for deeply. As they turned back to the stew, the protagonist felt a sense of finality. This was the beginning of something new, something neither of them could undo. And no matter how difficult the journey ahead would be, the protagonist knew one thing for sure. They would protect Zarek, no matter what it took. The next few days passed quickly. The protagonist had promised to help Zarek become a warrior, and now it was time to start his training. Zarek was eager to learn, and the excitement in his eyes was hard to ignore. He had always been curious about human culture, but now his curiosity had grown into something deeper, something far more serious. They started the training early in the morning, just after breakfast. The sun had barely risen, and the air was still cool. The protagonist led Zarek to the training grounds, a small open area behind their house, surrounded by trees. It wasn't much, but it was enough for what they needed. Zarek looked around, taking in the space. His sharp alien eyes were full of determination, but there was a hint of nervousness too. This wasn't like the peaceful lessons he had learned in his own world. This was real. This was preparation for something far more dangerous. The protagonist picked up a wooden practice sword, handing it to Zarek. The weapon was light, meant for training, not for actual battle. Still, it felt heavy in Zarek's small hands. "Hold it like this," the protagonist said, demonstrating the proper grip. "Your hand should be steady but not too tight. You need to be able to move quickly." Zarek nodded, adjusting his grip. His alien fingers were long and slender, but they quickly found the right position. The protagonist watched carefully, noting the way Zarek held the sword. He was doing well for a beginner, but the real test would come in time. "Now let's start with the basics," the protagonist continued. "You need to learn how to strike, how to defend, and how to move your body. It's all about balance and control. You need to be able to react without thinking." Zarek raised the sword awkwardly, trying to imitate the movements he had seen the protagonist make. At first, his swings were slow and uncoordinated, but with each attempt, his movements became a little more fluid. The protagonist couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. Zarek was learning quickly. After a while, the protagonist stopped and gave Zarek a break. They sat down on a nearby rock, taking a moment to catch their breath. The training was tough, but Zarek was pushing himself harder than the protagonist had expected. "You're doing well," the protagonist said, giving Zarek an encouraging smile. Zarek looked up, his silver eyes filled with excitement. "I want to be stronger. I want to protect the people I care about." The protagonist's heart swelled at his words. There was something so pure about Zarek's desire to learn, to grow. He wasn't doing this for glory or fame, he was doing it because he genuinely cared about those around him. It reminded the protagonist of their younger self, back when they had first picked up a weapon. But there was something else in Zarek's eyes, something deeper. Zarek wasn't just learning how to fight, he was also trying to understand what it meant to be human. The protagonist realized that in teaching Zarek, they were also teaching him about their own past, their own struggles, and their own journey. As the days passed, the training grew more intense. The protagonist pushed Zarek harder, testing his limits and teaching him the skills he would need in battle. They taught him how to handle a blade, how to use the terrain to his advantage, and how to read his opponent's movements. But it wasn't all about physical strength. The protagonist also taught Zarek about the mental side of being a warrior. They discussed the importance of strategy, the value of patience, and the necessity of making hard choices. Zarek listened carefully, absorbing every word. One evening, as they sat around the dinner table, Zarek asked a question that took the protagonist by surprise. "Did you ever regret becoming a warrior?" Zarek asked, his voice quiet. "Did you ever wish you could go back and live a peaceful life?" The question hung in the air. The protagonist had never really thought about it. They had lived a life of war, a life filled with battlefields and bloodshed. It had been their choice, their responsibility. But now, as they looked at Zarek, they realized how much they had changed. The life they had left behind no longer seemed as simple as it once had. "I don't know if I regret it," the protagonist said slowly. "But it's not an easy life. You lose things along the way, people, dreams, parts of yourself, but you also gain something. You become stronger. You learn things about yourself you never knew." Zarek nodded, as if understanding more than his age suggested. "I don't want to lose myself," he said, his voice filled with a quiet determination. The protagonist smiled gently, a sense of pride swelling in their chest. "You won't, Zarek. As long as you stay true to yourself, you'll never lose who you are." The conversation ended, but the words lingered in the air. The protagonist could see the growing bond between them. It wasn't just the bond of a mentor and student anymore. It was something deeper, something that went beyond blood. Zarek was no longer just a child they had promised to protect. He was a person, someone with dreams and fears, someone they cared about deeply. The training continued, but now there was a sense of partnership. The protagonist wasn't just teaching Zarek, they were learning from him too. Zarek's enthusiasm, his unwavering commitment to becoming a warrior, reminded the protagonist of the things they had once believed in. And in that moment, the protagonist realized that this wasn't just about teaching Zarek to be a warrior. It was about teaching him to find his place in the world, to become someone who could protect others without losing themselves in the process. It was a lesson they both needed to learn. The days turned into weeks, and the training continued. Zarek had grown stronger, more skilled with each passing day. The protagonist could see the progress in him, the way his movements became quicker, more precise, and the way his confidence started to shine through. But there was a part of the protagonist that still worried. No matter how skilled Zarek became, no matter how hard he trained, the battlefield was never truly predictable. And Zarek was still just a child, no matter how mature he seemed. One morning, after a particularly grueling training session, Zarek collapsed on the grass, breathing heavily but with a smile on his face. The protagonists, though tired themselves, sat down beside him. "You did well today," the protagonist said, wiping the sweat from their brow. Zarek nodded, his breathing slowing down. "I want to be ready. I want to protect my people when the time comes." The words were simple, but they carried a weight that the protagonist had not expected. Zarek's eyes burned with the same fierce determination that the protagonist had seen in their own reflection years ago, the same fire that led them into battle, time and time again, pushing them past their limits. But that fire, that drive, had a cost. The protagonist knew that better than anyone. They had paid that price already, and they didn't want Zarek to face the same fate. "Zarek," the protagonist began, their voice softer than usual. "Being a warrior isn't just about strength, it's about sacrifice. You might have to do things that change you, things that you can't take back. The battlefield is not just a place of glory, it's a place where you lose parts of yourself, parts of the people you care about." Zarek's gaze didn't falter. He turned his head, meeting the protagonist's eyes with an intensity that surprised them. "I know what I'm asking for, but I don't want to hide from it. I want to face it, to fight for the people I love." The protagonist's heart tightened. It was the same determination they had once had, the same desire to prove something, to be someone worth remembering. And they couldn't deny the truth. Zarek was ready in a way that most adults never were. But there was a difference. Zarek was still young, still learning, and the protagonist wasn't sure if they could live with themselves if something happened to him. They had already seen too many lives lost, too many young soldiers sent to the front lines before their time, and Zarek deserved more than that. "I don't want to stop you from doing what you think is right," the protagonist said, feeling the weight of their words. "But I need you to understand something. There are consequences. When you take up a weapon, you don't just fight your enemy, you fight your own fears, your own regrets. And no matter how strong you are, there will always be a part of you that wonders if you made the right choice." Zarek sat up, his face serious. "I understand, but I'm not afraid of that. I'm not afraid of the future. I just want to be ready for it." The protagonist looked at him, seeing the maturity in Zarek's eyes. It was clear now that this wasn't a phase for him. This wasn't a fleeting dream. Zarek wasn't just asking for training. He was asking for the tools to face the unknown. And the protagonist couldn't deny him that. They had seen the strength inside him, the same strength that had driven them all those years ago. It was that strength that made them realize they couldn't say no, not anymore. "All right," the protagonist said, their voice firm. "We'll continue your training. But understand this. Once you choose this path, there's no turning back. You'll be a warrior, and everything that comes with it will be your responsibility. I'll teach you, but you have to be prepared to face the consequences of your decisions." Zarek's face lit up with a mixture of relief and excitement. "I'm ready. I promise. I won't let you down." The protagonist stood up, extending a hand to help Zarek to his feet. "Then let's get started. We've got a lot of work to do." The next few days were even harder than before. The protagonist pushed Zarek to his limits, testing his endurance, his reflexes, and his mental strength. The training became more intense, more focused. They practiced combat tactics, taught Zarek how to read his opponent's movements, and spent hours working on strategy. Zarek absorbed everything like a sponge, never once questioning the difficulty, never once complaining. But as the days passed, the protagonist could see the toll it was taking on him. Zarek was becoming more than just a student. He was becoming a warrior. And with that transformation came a new weight, a burden that the protagonist had hoped to shield him from. One evening, after a particularly difficult sparring session, Zarek collapsed again, but this time, he didn't smile. His breathing was heavy, his face pale, and for the first time the protagonist saw something in him they hadn't noticed before. Doubt. Zarek looked up at the protagonist, his eyes filled with uncertainty. "Do you ever wonder if you've made the wrong choice?" he asked, his voice quiet. "Do you ever wish you could just walk away from all of this?" The question was simple, but it cut deep. The protagonist took a long breath, sitting beside Zarek on the ground. "Every day," they admitted. "But that's the thing about choices. We make them and then we live with them. You've made your choice, Zarek, and there's no going back. But that doesn't mean you can't find peace in it. Just remember, being a warrior isn't about fighting for glory. It's about fighting for something you believe in." Zarek nodded slowly, his face a mixture of exhaustion and determination. "I believe in protecting those I love. That's enough for me." The protagonist smiled, though there was a hint of sadness in their eyes. "Then you're on the right path." And with that, they both stood up, ready to continue the journey they had started together. The path ahead was uncertain, and the dangers were real, but one thing was clear. Zarek had chosen his path, and the protagonist would help him walk it no matter what it took. The sun was setting again, casting long shadows across the training grounds. The air had grown cooler, the days beginning to slip into the crispness of autumn. Zarek was kneeling in the grass, his sword resting beside him. As he caught his breath after another round of intense training, the protagonist stood nearby watching him closely. They had been pushing Zarek harder than ever in the past few weeks, testing his physical and mental limits. The training had become grueling, sometimes lasting hours, sometimes stretching into the darkness of night. It wasn't just about strength anymore. It was about endurance, speed, and the ability to think on his feet, even when everything around him seemed to fall apart. Zarek had become faster, his movements sharper, but it wasn't enough. The protagonist knew that it never would be. The battlefield was unpredictable. Strength alone wouldn't save him. Zarek needed to learn the harder lessons. The lessons about the mind, the heart, and the soul. Zarek, the protagonist called, their voice carrying across the quiet field. Get up. You're not done yet. Zarek groaned but pushed himself to his feet. He wiped the sweat from his brow and reached for his sword. There was no complaining, no hesitation. He was determined, and that determination had kept him going longer than the protagonist had expected. They continued the training, this time focusing on combat strategy. Zarek learned how to read the terrain, how to use the environment to his advantage. He practiced blocking strikes, dodging, and counterattacking. The protagonist instructed him on the importance of staying calm, even when the chaos of battle threatened to overwhelm him. After several hours, the protagonist called a halt to the training, sensing that Zarek was beginning to tire. They sat, down on a rock nearby, watching the young alien with a mixture of pride and concern. Zarek was stronger now, but that didn't mean he was ready. Not yet. Zarek joined the protagonist on the rock, his shoulders slumped from exhaustion. How am I doing? He asked, his voice still carrying that determination, despite the weariness in his tone. You're doing well, the protagonist replied, looking at him with a soft smile. But there's still more to learn. The training isn't just about strength, it's about control. You need to control your emotions, your instincts. They can help you in battle, but they can also cloud your judgment if you're not careful. Zarek nodded, listening closely. He had learned quickly, but the lessons were never easy. The protagonist could see how much Zarek wanted this. It wasn't just about being strong anymore. It was about something deeper, something more personal. Zarek had changed over the course of their training. His eyes were more focused now, his mind sharper. He wasn't just learning to fight. He was learning to survive. But the protagonist couldn't ignore the nagging worry in their chest. There were still many things they hadn't told Zarek, things they hadn't been able to explain. No matter how much training Zarek went through, the protagonist knew that there would always be something unpredictable about battle, and it was that unpredictability that worried them. They didn't want Zarek to face that unpredictability alone. Not yet. Not when he was still so young. One evening, as they sat together by the fire, Zarek spoke again, breaking the silence that had settled between them. I've been thinking, he began, his voice serious. When will I know if I'm ready? When will I know if I'm truly a warrior? The protagonist looked at him for a long moment, the flames from the fire casting flickering shadows on their face. Zarek's question was simple, but it was a question that the protagonist had asked themselves many times before. The answer wasn't easy. You'll know when the time comes, the protagonist said, their voice quiet but firm. But it's not about when you're ready. It's about what you do when you're called. It's about standing up and doing what needs to be done, even when you're scared, even when you're unsure. Zarek's expression softened. I understand. I don't want to be afraid. I want to be strong. You are strong, the protagonist said with a reassuring smile. But remember, strength isn't just about how well you fight. It's about how you handle everything that comes after. The victories, the losses, the things you can't control. That's the real test of a warrior. The fire crackled, and Zarek sat quietly for a moment, taking in the words. The protagonist knew that Zarek was beginning to grasp the complexity of what it meant to be a warrior. It wasn't just about the physical fight, it was about the internal battle as well. Over the next few days, the training became more focused. They began to test Zarek's decision-making skills, challenging him to think on his feet and make quick, life-altering choices. The protagonist set up mock battles, forcing Zarek to face off against imaginary enemies, learning how to assess a situation and make the best move in the heat of the moment. They also spent hours discussing tactics and the art of war, preparing Zarek for the mental and emotional challenges he would face. One afternoon, while they were practicing defense techniques, Zarek asked a question that caught the protagonist off guard. Do you ever wish you didn't have to fight? Do you ever wish you could just walk away from all of it? The question was simple, but it made the protagonist pause. It was a question they had asked themselves many times, especially in the quiet moments when the weight of their past felt like too much to carry. They had seen the cost of war, the toll it took on the soul, and sometimes they had wished for an escape. But there was no escape. Not for them. Not for Zarek. I've asked myself that many times, the protagonist admitted, but sometimes you don't get a choice. The world is full of danger, and sometimes you have to fight even when you don't want to. The important thing is to fight for what's worth fighting for. Zarek nodded slowly, as if understanding something deeper than he had before. I want to fight for my people. I want to protect them just like you protect us. The protagonist smiled. Then you're on the right path, Zarek, and you're stronger than you think. As they continued the training, the protagonist realized something important. Zarek was no longer just a student. He was becoming a warrior, and whether the protagonist was ready for it or not, the time would come when Zarek would face the ultimate test. But for now, the protagonist would continue to guide him, knowing that their bond was stronger than any weapon they could ever wield. The day had come. Zarek stood at the edge of the training grounds, his sword in hand, eyes fixed on the horizon. The sun was high, casting long shadows on the dirt, the air thick with the heat of midday. His breathing was steady, but there was a tension in the air. Today wasn't like the other days. Today was different. Today was the day he would face his first real test. The protagonist stood behind him, watching quietly, their hands folded, in front of them. They had been preparing Zarek for this moment for weeks, teaching him not only how to fight but also how to think, how to make decisions when it mattered most. They had pushed him hard, sometimes harder than he wanted, but it was all for this moment. This was the test of everything he had learned. Are you ready? The protagonist asked, their voice calm but with a hint of something deeper, a mix of pride, concern, and something else Zarek couldn't quite place. Zarek turned around, his face serious, but his eyes sparkled with a quiet confidence. I'm ready, he said. His voice was steady, but there was an edge to it, something that had grown in him over the past weeks, something that now made him feel stronger than he ever had before. The protagonist nodded. Good. Remember everything I've taught you. Don't just fight the enemy. Fight your own fears, your doubts. Trust yourself. Zarek nodded and turned back toward the horizon. In the distance, he could see the faint outlines of training dummies placed in various positions across the field. These weren't just any dummies. They were designed to simulate real threats, movable targets that mimicked the unpredictability of an enemy in combat. His task was simple: defeat every target, each one more difficult than the last. It was a challenge that would test his speed, his accuracy, and his ability to think quickly under pressure. He gripped his sword tighter, taking a deep breath. The air was thick with tension, but Zarek's mind was clear. He had come a long way, from the days when he could barely hold the sword without it feeling too heavy. Now it felt like an extension of his own body. The first target moved. It was a simple strike, a dummy that moved toward him at a slow pace, as if testing his reflexes. Zarek wasted no time. With a swift motion, he slashed through the target, bringing his sword down with precision. The target fell, its lifeless body crumpling to the ground. Zarek didn't stop. He was already moving toward the next target, his mind focused. One by one, he eliminated them, his movements quick, sharp, and controlled. The sweat beaded on his forehead, but he pushed forward, ignoring the strain in his muscles, ignoring the fatigue that started to creep in. He had trained for this, and now it was time to prove that he could handle the pressure. The protagonist watched from a distance, their heart pounding with each swing of Zarek's sword. Zarek was fast, more than they had expected. His technique was solid, and his movements were precise. But there was something more, something deeper that the protagonist could see in the way Zarek fought. He wasn't just reacting to the dummies. He was anticipating them, thinking 2 or 3 steps ahead. The protagonist's heart swelled with pride, but there was a lingering fear too. This wasn't just training anymore. This was real. And in the back of their mind, the protagonist couldn't help but wonder, was Zarek ready? Zarek's pace slowed, slightly as the targets became more complex. The dummies started moving faster, their movements erratic, designed to throw him off balance. But Zarek didn't falter. He adjusted his stance, anticipating the next move, and with each strike, he moved more fluidly. It wasn't just about strength now, it was about control, about thinking in the heat of the moment. But then, just as he was nearing the last few targets, something unexpected happened. One of the dummies moved differently. It wasn't following the pattern it had been assigned. It darted in a way Zarek wasn't prepared for, catching him off guard. He barely managed to block the first strike, but the second one hit him, a glancing blow across his shoulder. Zarek gritted his teeth, the sting of the hit sending a jolt of pain through his body. But he didn't stop. He pushed through the pain, focused on the task at hand. He sidestepped the next attack and countered, his sword striking true. The dummy fell. For a moment there was silence. Zarek stood in the center of the training field, breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling with each breath. He had done it. He had faced the challenge, and he had overcome it. But even though the training session was over, there was no celebration, no cheering. It wasn't about that. The protagonist walked toward him, their footsteps slow but deliberate. They stopped just in front of Zarek, looking him over carefully. The young alien was bruised, exhausted, but there was a glow of triumph in his eyes. "You did well," the protagonist said, their voice steady but filled with emotion. "You passed the test." Zarek's face softened, the tension in his body easing as the realization hit him. He had done it. He had faced the challenge and come out victorious. But more than that, he had learned something deeper about himself. He had learned that being a warrior wasn't just about strength or skill. It was about overcoming doubt, pushing through pain, and trusting in your ability to do what needed to be done, even when everything seemed uncertain. The protagonist placed a hand on Zarek's shoulder, looking at him with a mixture of pride and something else, something that felt like a quiet farewell, as if they knew the time was coming when Zarek would no longer need their guidance. "You're ready," the protagonist said, their voice filled with quiet certainty. Zarek nodded, his expression solemn. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for everything." As they stood there, the setting sun casting long shadows across the field, the protagonist realized that their work was done. Zarek had become the warrior he had always wanted to be. But more than that, he had become someone who could face the world with strength, with courage, and with a heart that was unyielding in the face of whatever challenges lay ahead. And for the protagonist, that was enough.